I'm trying a totally different setup, so we'll see what happens here. All right, I'm going to be jumping around a lot. Yeah, shoelaces. Yeah, I mean, basically, yeah, I don't actually have a shoe model, I don't think, on me, but yeah, we can sort of cover that. Yeah, shoelaces, if you want to do them, you can just make them for the high res for sure. Like, my motto is model everything that you see, so you want to get every detail. On the low res, oftentimes we'll actually make kind of a shell mesh that, you know, that sort of like roughly fits the overall form, but it doesn't necessarily go, you know, cover the shoelaces. So, yeah, it's going to be available after as a stream, so if you can't watch all of it, or if you have to go, or if you just want to skim to parts that are more relevant, that's totally fine. It's funny, I was actually watching a 2-hour live stream from Michael Pavlovich, who I've recommended a bunch of his tutorials. He did one about 6 days ago where he just does a shoe, and I can kind of cover the simplified topics of that, just getting the shapes right. Yeah, so right now I'm just kind of messing around, gonna make maybe a set of stairs. So right now I'm using Z Modeler, that's B for brush, Z for Z Modeler, and then the shortcut combo is M, that's in the upper left corner of the button. So you can always hit that as a combination. And if you hold spacebar, right now it's on insert, you can tell it to be on multiple loops. And you can say interactive resolution, which is really, really fun. So you click on that and you drag this up. Now it's doing a couple things. I think it's creasing, which I don't necessarily care for. I also just want it to be either the same polygroup. I can say, hey, keep the polygroup. By the way, I'm using a little software that, as you can maybe see, it actually highlights my cursor clicks. I am actually using a mouse, but if I were using a tablet, it'd be the same thing. Left click and hold is the same thing as just left mouse button and down. So there. I'm not sure why I'm getting creases at the bottom there, but yeah. For me, that doesn't really matter. I can just tell it to uncrease all. So if you want a nice even division for, let's say, smoothing, if you wanted to try to smooth that, I generally don't recommend smoothing simple hard edge objects like this. Let me just go to uncrease. This is under geometry crease, uncrease all. Now, if you divide, you can see you get this lumpy stuff. Let me just go back and check the chat actually for a second. Okay, cool. I just want to make sure I'm answering everybody's questions. I think there may also be a little lag or delay, so if there's anything, by the way, like I think I have a bit of royalty-free music on, so if that's bugging anybody, just let me know and I can kind of turn it down. I might actually turn it down for myself just a bit. There we go. So, yeah, when you're sculpting stuff, it's actually kind of good to have consistent, even mesh throughout, especially if you're planning on damaging, you know. Later on, if I didn't need the backside, I could always delete the backside or the bottom. If it's covered up with a ground plane, I can always get rid of that. I often like to work in perspective, so I can sort of get a real sense of the object. So yeah, I'm going to start in my own custom interface. So a few things I should mention. A lot of the top menu stuff, where like the move brush, the buttons, the scale, rotate, move tool, like WER, that's all here. Z intensity, focal shift, basically all the brush stuff that was on the top is on the side. I removed actually the zoom, the actual pixels. There's a bunch of stuff that actually kind of allows you to zoom into the document, which I think is somewhere in here. These buttons here, they're useful in a handful of situations, so that's why I took them out. They're on the sidebar in the default, so if you take a look, let me just restore the custom. Oops, sorry, no, not custom. Restore standard. Right, this scroll zoom, you're actually just zooming in, but you can see it's just like zooming into a Photoshop document. It just gets really, really pixelated. And then when you zoom out, you know, sometimes people zoom all the way out and then they can't get the full workspace. If I set this back to actual, it should roughly work. But even then, you know, this document space, you can see it's cut off on the left side because it was set up. This document size is actually meant to fit my workspace. And you can actually just go to new document anytime you have a bit of a weirdly cropped document space. Now it will clear the model, but it doesn't mean that the model's gone. If you close ZBrush, it will be gone, but it should still be in your palette over on the right side, which I may just reset for simplicity here. So you can see now I've got a full workspace. So again, I find these buttons useless, so I took these out. If I go back to my custom, this is really designed for me, like most used tools, Dynamesh. I haven't really actually used Testimate a whole lot, but there's a couple of options here for basically the new Sculptress tool. And again, I think, where did I put my Sculptress button? Actually, it's a good question. I hope I didn't destroy it, but nope, it's not hidden over there. Yeah, by the way, this is something you can do in ZBrush as well. I think it's just in here, actually. Yeah, I think I have to be in draw mode. Yeah, I don't, oh no, sorry, it's over here. Yeah, let me just make sure I'm in a make polymesh, because I don't think it's a polymesh, but I moved the Sculptress button over here. And yeah, you need to be in a regular sculpting brush to actually then activate the Sculptress tool. So I can, right, kind of damage that way, but let me just get back to chat for a sec. Okay. And I'll just double check something else too. Yeah, no comments here. Okay. Now, before I get back into this, I'm going to mention a couple things. So myself and a couple of people, professors from illustration and design, have put together essentially a mini conference. It's a full day of speakers from 10 a.m. to roughly 4:35 o'clock p.m. Saturday, the 21st. It's totally free. These people are amazing. I will say that for sure. So there's Geneviève Goubeau. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right, but she does a lot of beautiful illustration work. We've got Henry Fong, who's actually good friends with a lot of people from the 3D and animation department. So he's done a lot of really cool art direction and concept design for, you know, major movies, major films, right? Worked on Shazam, The Boys, the first It from 2017. So you can go through and check out the sort of work that he's done. It's really, really amazing, really beautiful stuff. So that's Henry Fong, our second speaker, and then so Geneviève is at 10 a.m. Henry will be at 1, and Alina will be at 3. She's come by and given a guest lecture, but I don't know that you guys have seen her work, but she does a lot of really cool 3D ZBrush character work, and she's into 3D printing, works at a game studio. One of my favorite artists, I would say, right now. So anyways, hopefully you guys can check that out. I'll post the link in the chat, and I'm going to post it in our Facebook group. And it'll also be promoted a bit later today. Okay. The second thing. By the way, I just want to make sure everybody can hear me, right? How do you unselect something in ZModeler after you... I think you just hit it with Alt again, if I'm not mistaken. Oops, where'd my... So yeah, if I hit Alt... Oops, let me go back to ZModeler. You know, it's funny, I don't have that ZModeler brush just like mapped to one shortcut. So yeah, if you hit Alt again... Yeah, I think that's it. Or you can... Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I'm not sure about that. I'm still kind of getting used to this functionality. I think you can just actually undo and reselect, but there's got to be another way. If I hold Alt-Shift, no. Shift, no. Alt-Click? Yeah, I think Alt-Click just brings it right back. Right, so then I can... Yeah, for some reason it wasn't working for me right away, but yeah, if you Alt-Paint, I think I'm on delete. Oh, I guess not. Let me be careful with this there. So if I click back, then you can extrude out. QMesh is interesting. You know, I'm just getting into QMesh. Extruding, if you are using ZModeler, right? So that's B, Z, M. And if you pull that out, right? Or let's say I undo. If I pull this out, it's really cool. If I click on the next one, it just repeats my last function. So that's really, really useful compared to maybe something like Maya, which may not give you that kind of clean flexibility. So let's say you pull this out. Next to it, you pull out another edge. Right away, it actually tries to do this kind of sloping edge. But then as you pull out, it gives you a nice flat, even surface. And there's no polygons in between, which if you were to do that in Maya, there'd be basically two polygons. This one, and then one on the other side from Yeah, and now I'm getting this weird thing. So that's kind of cool if you want to do like a beveled approach. And then I think if you click on the next poly, again, it doesn't quite work with bridge polys, but if I click on this, it should go to the next extrusion height. So if I do that extrusion again, click, click, click. Okay, let's just double check the chat. Yeah, there's some really great stuff. Okay. If you can't tell, I research and work and try to like push stuff all the time. So if you take a look at my tabs, I have a lot of tabs, number one, which is a problem. Number two, there's a lot of stuff in here. So there is Poly Q Mesh, which I believe is a really great short, like 6-minute video. I'm going to just play it and mute it for a second so you guys can kind of see like everything I'm talking about is pretty much going to be, you know, that I've just talked about is going to be in here and more. And yeah, one of the, it's funny because I watched this the other week because I really wanted to learn more about Q Mesh, right? What's kind of cool about this is that if you extrude, this is something I noticed I had a problem with the other day. If you extrude negatively, right, if I try to pull in, you can get some weird faces. I mean, this is another issue just because we have, again, a polygon on top of another polygon, which would technically be kind of illegal. So in a situation like this, what you'd want to do is hovering over a polygon face, hold space bar, and go to delete, single poly. And then we can delete that and delete that. And you want to see double-sided polys. That would be ideal. So, yeah, and then I could, you know, I'd have to basically weld that polygon. So I could probably go to stitch. And it'd be a similar kind of operation if I did something like this in Maya as well. Let me just make sure I get this spot on. Oops. One of the many problems. Sometimes you got to watch your selection. There we go. Okay, so but yeah, with Q Mesh, I find it's interesting. So if we go to yeah, Q Mesh again, right? It really like automatically kind of pushes it in and back, gets rid of that mesh, and if you go back far enough, it'll give you that nice flat square negative extrusion with the polygons facing the correct direction. So that's really, really cool. By the way, can everybody hear me okay? I just want to double check. Is audio okay? And by the way, I'm testing out actually this new version of this software. I hope it helps. Their font size. Okay, there we go. That's good. Maybe turn this off. So yeah, basically whenever I hit a key, it's going to like pop up real quickly. And hopefully, and my mouse strokes as well. So just want to make sure audio is okay. All right, I'm jumping around a lot. I apologize. I do this all the time. Probably why I have ADD. One other thing I should mention, I think this code is still good. It's this really amazing app which I have called XMD. Basically, you get a premium lifetime membership. It's $70, and I think right now, if you apply this code premium60, so I'll post both of these in the chat, and I'll put them in the Facebook group. I think, yeah, right now it's a limited offer, but yeah, $70, 60% off. So what's 4 times 70 roughly is $28. I think it's US. It'll probably want it being like $38, but still really, really good. Really amazing toolkit, and yeah, I've got tons and tons of brushes. I believe I don't know if I have mine updated actually, but yeah, I've got a ton of brushes here, tons of folders. There's different categories, and so instead of like going through file folders and looking at thumbnails and stuff like that, you know, you basically just pick the brush you want, you go into the category you want, and it sends it right over to ZBrush. So it's really, really a useful tool. Making snake scales on a model. Okay, that's cool. So I'll post this. I'll post, let's go back to XMD source. So anybody who's, I think even just, as a student, if that 30, 40 bucks, there's so many great tools that are productive. So there's one thing I'll show you guys. ZBrush, actually, if you go to ZBrush Alpha downloads, okay, there's something called the Download Center. Now, a lot of these are a little bit dated. So here they have a very, very basic example of some that are done as alphas, okay? And if I download this, again, I think they're very low res. And there are plenty of people, who have made they made a bunch of alphas. So let me just switch to a sphere. Oh my God, I'm dying. Okay. All right. So I'll just switch to my standard brush. So for me, the standard brush is number one. Literally the number one on my keyboard. Go to Alpha, import. Let's go to my downloads here. What was it called? I have too much crap in my download folder if you can't tell. I think it was DM something. So these are fairly old. I don't even think that's the right alpha. 600 pixel by 600 pixel. And you often, for your mesh, it needs to be fairly high res. Let me just switch my sculpting material here. I usually like to go the blue. So if I drag this out, you'll get kind of like rough scales like that. If you want the full texture, you have to take your focal shift to -100. That can be a little bit problematic, obviously, as it's a big square patch. So a lot of times if you're dragging this stuff out, that should be it. Let me also open up the PSD, because it may actually have multiple layers. I think it actually possibly does. So there are alphas. That's one way to do it. And if you Google ZBrush alpha scales, again, there's so many that have already just been made and created for you. So this is one, and it's, again, this is via Pinterest, so God only knows where that's going to take me. Yeah, let's see. So there's so many alphas, and a lot of them are actually generated by sculpting the mesh first. So, let's see if we got something else here. Yeah, that one doesn't look too bad. Yeah, I think this one, for some reason, the one I downloaded isn't the correct alpha, but let's see, view original. But if we're not dealing with, oh my God, so many pop-ups, right? I find Google and the internet in the last 10 years has just gotten so much worse. So I think this is roughly the scales. Again, I don't know what's spitting these up, but yeah, the alphas, I think I actually have one somewhere, but let me just take a look. Scales, these don't look like really good scales. Okay. Okay, let's take a look at ZBrush for a sec. So, if you wanted to, okay, let's go back to the question here. If you wanted to make your own alphas, yes, making your own alphas is a very underrated skill. That is for sure, Mark. So, the other thing you can do, let me just do something like this. I'm going to go in. You can sculpt it. So, if we take a look at a scale, I think the best thing to do, actually this site is amazing, by the way, ZBrush guides. They have a ton of really amazing stuff, alphas and all sorts of things. I'm not sure. I don't know that they have any. Yeah, this might actually be it. Let me see what we got here. Yeah, I'm going to save that. I'm going to show you guys a couple other things too, like taking an alpha, turning into mesh. Because like I said, some alphas are derived from mesh. Some are just photoshopped. Some are taken from mesh, but you can actually take an alpha and turn it back into mesh. So I'll show you guys a couple really cool things with that. So in this case, I actually found a good alpha from that website. And if we go back to our sphere here, right, you get really good, pretty convincing scales. And like I said, if you adjust your focal shift, you can kind of get, you know, a faded area, and then you can try to kind of blur that or kind of mix it in. If you're applying it to a whole 3D model like this, there's a really cool way to do it. If you go into what's it called, surface, under surface, you can go to noise, and then if you actually load, you can load in the same alpha here, and I can adjust my alpha scale, and I'm going to adjust the mix strength, I think down to 1. Let me just try that out. Yeah, there we go. And I'll take the strength up. The mix is basically, there's like the fine noise, which is this sort of noise here, the kind of built-in noise, and it mixes it with the alpha, but I just want the alpha, and then I want to drop the alpha scale down. So again, you want to make sure you get your directionality right, whether you go positive or negative. In fact, this way looks more correct, going negative. And then I'll say okay. And right now, you see it's kind of stretching through the mesh. You can apply that. Technically right now, this is just like a low poly preview. So if I hit apply to mesh, it will apply to the surface. The way to fix this is actually a bit ingenious. So let me go load up our old friend, what's his name? Earthquake, the big boy. Now, the reason I'm going to load him up is very specific. So right now he has a texture. Let's just solo that. Take all his clothes off. Zip! And they're gone. So I'm going to go to Poly Paint. I got to find out how to do this. I actually want to alphabetize this list so it makes a bit more sense. Because I always want to go like polygroups instead of Poly Paint. So I want to just turn off colorize just so I'm looking at the mesh. And right now you guys notice he has a low poly. If I hit Shift D, right, that's what I'm doing here. Shift D to go down, D to go up, because he has divisions. I can do that. I also want to double check if he has UVs. So if I were to go to polygroups, you can say auto group with UV. So right now, if you say auto group with UV, it should take the UV islands and just keep the color the same, or maybe switch them around. But right now, there's no UVs. But because he's in very simple groupings, and I may want to do this too. If I wanted to really do a good polygroup here, let me just see. I'm going to quickly switch this. There we go. Let's go to double-sided so I can see everything. Anyways, you can split the front and the back. I don't have to get super precise about it, but I'll just do a quick sloppy job here just to get the point across. Okay, whatever. He's got 2 polygroups on the top. Not the best, but if you go to Z plugin, UV master, turn on polygroups if you don't have it on, and hit unwrap, and it's that simple. It can give you at least a rough unwrap. And while you're working, you can actually clone the tool into another kind of button area here, another temporary tool. So you can say work on clone. It creates a clone, a CL, and usually with that one, I just like to check it out by going to flatten. You know, it's not terrible. You can undo that if you want. Usually it's actually better to go to unflatten so you get out of that weird workspace, but I'm going to go back to the original. So he has UVs. I only go work on clone after I've done the unwrap, so I can just check out the flattening, because sometimes if you undo or start sculpting and you don't get out of that, if you don't go into the unflatten button, you can kind of screw things up, so it's always safe to work on the clone copy. Anyways, the point of all that, let's go back up to his high res. I may even divide him one step higher. By the way, I just updated my laptop. I'm working on a half-decent laptop. It's got now 48 gigs of RAM. The RAM has made a huge difference for me going into higher res sculpting. Really, ZBrush relies on CPU and RAM, a ton. Lots of RAM. So what I'm going to do is go back to surface, go to noise, and I want to show you this because this thing has UVs now, right? If I go to alpha, let's bring in the scales. Again, I'm going to crank the alpha scale. Turn the mix down to 0, so it's just going to favor the one the alpha itself. Let's crank that up and maybe bring the scaling down. Again, I think for some reason this one prefers to be in the negative value rather than the positive, because it looks like it's digging in rather than pulling those scales out. So I'm going negative for that. So right now you see, again, the problem is it's sort of stretching. Okay. What you can do with that is go from 3D to UV. So it'll actually try to position these correctly according to your UVs. Now, you know, there are problems with seams, right? So if I had better UVs, if I hid the seams better under maybe like his belly fat and stuff, inner leg seams, right? But this is a way you can get way better sort of scales across the surface like this. Okay. Now you can mix in noise. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe crank the scale so you can kind of make things a little bit uneven in that sense. And let me just get the strength going here. There. So yeah, you can add a bit of kind of that randomness if you still wanted to mix in some noise. So that's that. And you can say apply to mesh. So it'll take a second to calculate out. And there you go. And check this out. If I go back to the poly paint, I haven't actually altered it at all. So there you go. So now you've got a creepy, scaly individual. I apologize. You know, some of the answers are a little bit longer, and I want to show you guys some of the features. Now, if you want to make your own scales, let's say you sculpted one. So I'll just start with a cube. Let's make this my start material. There we go. Now, I'll turn on the floor just so I can sort of see where I am in space here. So I'm going to just scale this a little bit flatter maybe. I'll hold rotate and hold shift while I rotate. And you can hold alt to reset your pivot to the world there. And then I'm going to maybe scale this thing a little bit longer. And I'll go to make polymesh so we can now sculpt in this thing. Usually when I'm sculpting, I kind of like to see the floor so I can see the bottom of the world. And then I'll take a look at the mesh here. Let's just divide it a couple times. Yeah, it's not terrible. I'll go into actually probably just Dynamesh right away. A lot of people ask too, like, when do you Dynamesh, when do you not Dynamesh? For me, if I'm just kind of figuring out a shape, I can Dynamesh and do it quickly. And then, you know, after I can retopologize it to get a clean, a cleaner mesh, especially if I'm going to duplicate it a bunch of times, which I may in fact do. So right now I'm just going to play with dam standard. Again, I'm in symmetry. And if I draw this out, one thing that can happen, as you can see, it's going through the back of the mesh. So the brush strength and the thickness of the mesh is causing it to kind of grab through both sides. So I usually have this button in my interface. It's in the lower left corner of my custom interface called double. Sorry, not double, but back face mask actually. Double side is for displaying the inside and outside of a polygon, or the back side of a polygon. But if you go to brush, it's actually buried under alpha, sorry, not alpha and texture, but auto masking, and it's a button right here. So when you click that off or on here, it's the same thing as if you do it in the interface, the custom interface. So then we can draw that out. Maybe I'll soften the sides a bit. And then you can also, you know, play around the move brush. You know, give it a different shape if you want. And if you hold Alt as well, Alt with the move brush will kind of pull in the direction the polygon's already facing. Again, I'll turn off Dynamesh if I think I'm kind of ready to do something with this. Maybe do a Zeri mesh. Okay, so this thing actually divided up really high, so I'm going to give it roughly the same polygon, maybe even double Zeri mesh. It's not too bad. I may just soften out some of the features just so I don't get kind of a super repetitive patterning there. So it doesn't look too bad. Now, this is doing it the mesh approach. So if I do want to put this on probably in the hundreds of times, you do have to think about the poly count. So this is 2,700 polys, so I may want to go in half and Z-remesh it one more time. And by the way, if adapt is on and adaptive size, you can turn those things down and Z-remesh, and you'll get a much more accurate poly count. So if I try to go down in half, it'll really bring it down in half. Okay, so next step. Let's take a look at chat. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, so this, my plan would be to make it what is known as an insert brush first. So if I go into the brush palette and say create insert mesh, I'll create a new one. And you have to be staring top down on that mesh. So the reason is that it uses that as a way to kind of drop that on a surface. So if I wanted to drop these scales on a separate mesh, we'll just delete lower on this, right? I can now safely drop these onto the surface of another model, right? So you can hand drop those things in, but that can also get a little tedious. So what we can also do, there's something called nanomesh. So let me just show you briefly what this does. So if I take just a regular cube, right, go back to ZModeler. ZModeler has a thing. If you hold spacebar and go to insert nanomesh, and you can do it on a single poly, okay? So if I insert nanomesh, you see it puts a cube down, right? Now what happens if I do insert all polygons? Well, it's going to put a cube on all polys. So hopefully you can sort of see the madness that you can get into here. So if I go back to that brush, it should still be flowing in here as an insert mesh, right? If I click on the insert mesh, I can also turn it into what's known as a nanomesh brush. So I'll click on that. And now if I insert on here and I say all polys, right? We can do something like this. Now, there's greater degrees of control if we go under the nanomesh panel. We can decide, what sort of patterns we have. We can tile it. We can rotate these all in a direction. So hopefully you guys can sort of see. Yeah, let me just get the rotation the right way there. Sorry, let's draw that out again. So yeah, we'll rotate these minus 90, I guess, and then I'll focus, I think, on the X. There we go. So yeah, if I go back to something like earthquake here. By the way, I divided him up to 4 million polys and deleted his low res. Because ZBrush, certain functions like doing an insert mesh, it will not allow you to edit the mesh or do an insert mesh when the mesh has divisions. And it'll ask you to freeze. I usually don't like freeze. I usually will just go, if I've got precious sculpting detail at high res, I just go to the high res and delete lower. The reason being is that I can actually go to reconstruct subdivision and it'll try to rebuild. So watch what happens. Every time I hit reconstruct subdivision, it's actually going back down in poly count intelligently, hopefully, and bringing back the low res basically. Now I think, I'm not 100% sure on this, I think you can potentially lose UVs that way. So you may want to actually freeze in some cases your subdivision. Just make sure you unfreeze very soon after. Okay, target poly count for environment for final film, question mark. Also ways to lower poly count, good topology for organic objects. Okay, well, I recommend around 1 million to 1.5 million polygons maximum for a whole scene for a student film. In feature film, you can go into like hundreds of millions of polys, even big budget games, but you just won't have the capacity to render that and manage that big of a scene. So I'll come back around to that in a second once I go over this nanomesh thing. So I've got that brush. It's telling me to freeze, so I can freeze in this case. So it temporarily hides all the division levels, allowing me to make changes. So I could add loops, I could change UVs, I can do an insert mesh, right? These scales aren't quite to the right size, and then once I was done the insert mesh, I would just Yeah, let's adjust the X rotation here. There. And you can adjust things like the offset. So is it offsetting on X? Is it offsetting on Y? Which I think I want it to float off the surface more, but that might be too much. Maybe Z offset is better. I think Z offset's better. Yeah. So I'll just do a little Z offset. And you can randomize. You know, you can have things randomized a little bit. Right, so this is an idea you can kind of use to put scales. This is obviously pretty gross. But if you wanted to build your own texture, though, let's come back around to this. So I'll go to a plane. I would literally take a simple plane, maybe not as high res. So I'd probably do like, I don't know, 12 by 12 or 16 by 16. Nice square plane. Do a make poly mesh. Do your insert and animesh, right? Get it the way you want it. So maybe hold shift, go to geometry, sorry, not geometry, but back in a nano mesh. And again, we want to make sure the rotations are nice and clean. And we can adjust the overall size. So we want just a good enough overlap. And then I think it was X rotation that I wanted, yeah. So that's one way you can, you know, try to play around with developing a scale pattern. And I'm going to maybe offset on the Y, which is oh, no, that's going the wrong way for me. So maybe Z, there. So it's going to float above the kind of texture, the original base plane. Now, to actually make this mesh, it's a little bit weird. We have to go to geometry and do what's called convert BPR to geo. I don't want to get into explaining exactly what that does, but let me just hide the plane for a second. So I'm going to Control Shift click and hide that plane and go to split hidden. And then you can hit Control D to divide once, maybe twice, that separated layer of scales. And then I've got the base layer here, right? So let me get it a solo mode so we've got both visible. And guess what? Now you go to brush, go to alpha and say from mesh. I want to capture an alpha from this mesh. And then you can zoom in just so you frame things up nicely. You know, maybe try to get it so you can get a bit of a tile. Sorry, let me just fix that zoom. There we go. And there you go. That's basically how this is created. Now, I always max out my resolution. I wish they could increase the resolution setting here. I don't know if you can manually type it in, actually. No. Caps out at 2K resolution. It'd be great to get to 4 or 8K for certain detailed things, but I'll say okay to that. So now you can drag that out as an alpha, right? Do what we did earlier. Let me undo a bit back here. Go back to heavy duty, high poly count, earthquake. There we go. So there's my new alpha, right? If I switch to standard brush, load the alpha, set it to drag. If you like the way that brush is set up, you can click on brush and say save as and say, oh, you know what, I've got a new scale brush. Okay, and it'll save it as the preset is or extension for the file is ZBP for ZBrush brush preset. Right, so you can, let me just turn off the surface preview so you can drag them out like I said earlier. Right, and you need resolution to support that, so this will probably need to be quite heavy to support at a certain resolution. Or again, we can go into noise and we can go in and edit this thing and import. I actually didn't save or export this out, and this is probably another good question that'll come up. If you go to alpha with the alpha selected, you can say export. Simple PSD is fine. Right? Because you will need to actually go in here. It's a little weird. This is almost like a little separate kind of plugin that's floating inside of, there we go. Look at that bad boy. There. So if you ever need to kind of rotate around, I usually just wind up flipping it, but I think there's a way to rotate it here. Yeah, not sure which of these sliders would do it, but let me just see here. Anyway, so hopefully that gives you guys an idea of how you can throw scales onto a character. Yeah, that's true. You can just duplicate the low res. That's a good point. Okay, yeah. So environments, I will talk about a couple interesting things. Let's see if we've got. Oh, yeah. This I've got the mesh at 20 million polys, so it's taking a while to calculate. But thankfully, my RAM held up just fine there. By the way, if you ever notice that you apply a surface noise and it still kind of comes out a little pixelated, it's one of two things. It's either the resolution of your alpha is very low, which in this case it isn't for me, or the mesh resolution isn't high enough to support it. So if I undo back with the surface noise acting as a live preview, technically right now this is what's known as BPR. BPR is essentially like ZBrush's built-in render engine, so it will calculate more lighting, higher quality looks for textures and things like that. So if you hit that, it'll calculate. I probably shouldn't do this with a 20 million poly mesh because it'll take forever, so I'll just hit escape. But let me just see if I turn down the resolution. I'll hit escape, escape, escape. Let's see. Okay, good. So yeah, let's say I drop the resolution a bit. It's, you know, even if I go super low, it's still showing up the same way because this is basically almost like a material preview. So it's not really showing you what the true surface looks like. Like I said, if you hit BPR, it'll again up the resolution. It'll pre-calculate a lot of stuff. It'll calculate shadows and highlights and extra things that you just don't see in the regular ZBrush document preview. So again, I think this thing is, yeah, I think I've got samples and all sorts of stuff cranked here, so I should probably just kill this anyways. The idea though is that, you know, even if you're at a lower resolution, let's say, you know, I think by default he's at 1.2 million polys at the highest. Oops. I'll just delete the higher. So if you preview this, so let's say you go into surface and you say, okay, I'm going to apply this to mesh, but then when you apply it, right, it looks really bad like this. One way around this is you can just say, okay, convert BPR to Geo. It'll kind of do this high resolution calculation. It'll look at how many times this alpha is applied to the surface and try to divide it up as high as it needs to. Again, I don't think that's high enough, so in this case you can just manually divide higher. But again, I don't really recommend going over like 5 to 10 million polys unless you have a decent to really good CPU and a lot of RAM. Otherwise it's very, very slow and laggy to work with. Okay, so what else? What else? Somebody was asking about. Sorry, I gotta change this song. This is so weird. Royalty-free music. Run the happy birthday section. Okay. So yeah, if you have a landscape, or let's say, yeah, I'll make something kind of quick. Let's say we make a rock or whatever. I don't think I have any in here, but oh, maybe actually there might be just like on a. Yeah, let's see what we got. Make polymesh, reset. If I go to B for brush, I for insert, I think there might be some sort of like terrain insert brush. Oops. Let's see. Spaceship primitives. Yeah, I can't remember. I think there was some. It might be in the extended categories. Let's see. Yeah, there's insert. Okay, so we got like bricks and things like that. Okay. Oops. Sorry, I don't know if that I loaded that. Okay, let me double check this again. Brush. Okay, there we go. Right. So we got this sort of guy, that sort of thing. I'm going to kind of just dynamesh all this stuff together just to sort of show you. Let's say we had a rocky sort of wall or a portion of terrain. Let's just kind of move this down here. Okay, so we'll clear that. I'm going to hide that mesh and I'll go to delete hidden, which is under geometry modified topology. So this is one subtool. And then if I go to geometry, dynamesh, just to dynamesh it together. If you're really dead set on keeping the resolution, then I recommend maybe cloning this thing, duplicate it once. And I actually like to dynamesh. If I'm going to make a merged object, dynamesh it once. I'm going to solo this, and you can sort of see how rough it is. Go to ZRemesh. This is going to be a bit of a tricky two-step. If you really have a dense, and I'm specifically talking about like damaged environments, rocky terrain, things that are very uneven. This, maybe to a certain degree, if you really want to get assets just into a game, what I would do is probably just actually, let's see. Yeah, I would ZRemesh first, fairly low. So I'm going to go very low. I'll set it to like 1,000 polys, or 100. See how low this gets. It's a little too low. Okay, so I'll crank it up a little more. ZRemesh. Yeah, I mean, that's not bad, but it's not great. So you can just, through ZRemeshing, get very low. Let's say I want to go a little higher. Okay, so that's not too bad. Now, the other thing is these two shapes, they're sitting on top of each other, right? If I get out of solo mode, you can see they're kind of roughly the same shape. Now, I'm going to go back into solo while looking at the new low res I have. And under subtool, project, project all. If I hit Control D to divide, you know, when you divide a bunch, it just looks like a lumpy piece of shit, basically. But if I undo, right, I'll go divide. Oops. Control D to divide. I usually divide and project. Divide, project. Control D, divide, project. Maybe divide one more time. And you can see this thing basically looks roughly as good as the original. There might be some little glitchy spots, which, again, I usually go down to the lowest res and maybe I fix through some smoothing or some moving. And then I fix through projection there. Step up, project. So sometimes you have to, you know, do a little bit of finessing, maybe a bit of touch-up sculpting. Okay, maybe I'll even divide one more time there. Okay, yeah, whenever you have crevices, by the way, it gets really, really difficult to kind of get in some of those spots, but so this thing is pretty low res, right? And if I do this, let's just go in. I'm going to go to the low res. And by the way, this is another kind of idea behind this. Let me just dock this so you guys can see. So this is the Z plugin UV master. I've just docked it to the left side by clicking on the little circle with an arrow coming out of it. You can work on a clone as well. So if I want to just work on the low res without getting that error message, starting double-sided, I'm going to just hide parts of the mesh off. And by the way, when you hold Control Shift, you can switch the stroke type to lasso, which is one I often use. So I'm just going to kind of break this up into a few good, clean, easy UV sections. So things, areas that will be, you know, kind of naturally broken up by the creases, so we can hide any seams, right? Now again, I would be a little bit more particular and accurate if this were production, but I'm gonna try to speed through this and be a little bit rougher here. Okay. So you can hit Control W, which makes a new group, okay? And then maybe through this one, I'm just gonna, again, I'll be a little rougher here, and yes, oops. We'll just say that's good. Okay, so we got 3 polygroups, right? Again, I usually want to go through the edges. Now what you can do with this is actually say, okay, I'm working on the clone, not the original. So I'm going to copy the UVs and go back to the original, which has the high res, but you have to be at your lowest resolution because the topology or the mesh has to match. And I'm going to say paste UVs. And then if you don't see the polygroups, you can go to polygroups, outer group with UV. That's weird. Let me just try that again. Paste, group with UVs. Very strange. Let me try this again. Copy UVs. Yeah, copy UVs, and then I want to just switch back to this one and paste UVs. And then we should be able to polygroup. That's so weird. Why is that? Auto group? No. UV group? No. Well, clearly something weird is happening there. But I guess if I go to flatten, let me just double check something here. I'll freeze temporarily, flatten. Wow, that's very bizarre. Well, we'll see if ZBrush recovers from that one. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I don't know what's going on with this thing. It's being incredibly weird. Copy UVs. Paste UVs. Well, if it's being strange, yeah, I don't get that. Maybe I'll just UV it directly again here. It's just kind of go polygroup. Okay, so that's not bad. So again, maybe I'll just, instead of working on the clone, let me just try to freeze this thing. Polygroups unwrap. You can flatten, just make sure you always unflatten. That looks good. Unflatten and make sure you unfreeze. Very important to bring back the subdivision levels. So if you want to avoid working on the clone, if the clone's being weird, which for some reason it is in this case, that's another kind of workaround. Okay, the whole point of this, let's see. Okay, so point number one is that if we go to UV map now, we can say, oh, let's maybe crank the texture to 8K. Go to texture map. I don't have any texture, but let's say I go to normal map, and then I can say, oh, I think I forgot to paste UVs. Ugh, so annoying. Let's see. Yeah, when you don't have any options to create texture maps or normal maps, it's usually because the textures, the UVs aren't there, so it needs the coordinates. Ah, it's still doing that thing. Well, this is very strange. Let me just check the mesh. This is also something very good to do. Check your mesh under mesh integrity, geometry mesh integrity, and you can also go to optimize points. So again, I'll try to let's say unwrap, flatten, looks good, unflatten, copy UVs, unfreeze, and then I'll paste the UVs onto the lowest subdivision. Yeah, I think what's happening, there might be some sort of weird glitch or bug happening here where when I made the clone, it did something different to the vertices of the edges, so it didn't kind of recognize that. Here, let's paste those UVs there. And now if I go to normal map, this should work. Shouldn't be in all that broken. There we go. So you guys hopefully can see that there. Now, what is interesting about this? If I take this, you know, you can save it out or export it. If you take this mesh, actually let me go up to the high res. You can do a third thing. So we did zero mesh, right, which reduces the mesh, keeps it clean. But let's say you want to kind of keep as many of the details as possible here, but you want to also keep that texture map, the UVs, and really strip this down. This is done in the games industry a lot, and I think to some degree in film as well for matte paintings. But you can go to Z plugin, decimation master. So what this will do, you have to pre-process, and you can do the current subtool or all subtools. So if you had more than one subtool, you can do it across all of them. In this case, I just want to take this one, which has the UVs. And remember, I did the UVs, so I can say keep UVs. What this will do is keep all the vertices that are important to the UVs along those seams or edges. It'll keep the UV layout. I'm going to say let's pre-process the current. So it's going to calculate the mesh and see how many edges or polygons it can strip out of the model. I'm actually going to be showing this in third year as well. Yeah, my looked like ZBrush was dying, but it survived. So when you pre-process, it's just doing like a calculation, and depending on whatever options, if you wanted the border to be exactly the same, it would be the border for the model at this resolution. But when you say keep UVs, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's only referring to the lowest subdivision version of those UVs. And now you can decimate. So that basically means if let's just do a decimate current and I can undo. So literally we'll try to strip out. Right now I went from 920 something thousand polys to 184. So roughly 20%. And it looks about the same. If I undo and redo, you can't tell the difference between the two versions. Right? So if I do Shift S, which is a snapshot, and redo, they look identical, right? So I'm going to undo just to go back to where it's been pre-processed, but you can drop this number way low. So you can set it by percentage. So you can say, I want to be 1% of this, which is still 18,000 polys, or you can do a poly count. I could say I want to be 300 poly. No, this is in thousands, I should say. So you can go by polys or by, yeah, let's say if I go half, or maybe, yeah, 0.3 thousand polys, and I'll say decimate current. Now that's a little too low, so we can always kind of bump this up maybe to like 0.5, sorry, decimate current. Right, so you got this very simplified form, but if I go Z this should send it over to Maya. Right? So I've seen, very complex rocky surfaces treated this way, and it doesn't look terrible, it actually winds up working out okay. So yeah, this should be sending over any second. There's the model, right? Now, let's just take a look. I'll click off the model. Okay, so I think it's actually done some smoothing, if I'm not mistaken. So it looks a little smooth, and if you didn't have smoothing on, if we went to mesh display and had it on hard edge, it would look very rocky, which you might like for the reflective aspects, but or a stylized look. In this case, I'll probably just go to soften all the edges, so it kind of blends everything together. And then if I go to the attribute editor, delete the history, that's Alt-Shift-D. I usually like to set this to a blend just to test the normal map, and the normal map usually has to be set to raw. Yeah, I think there's something weird with my color management. Is it on? Is it working? Okay. Yeah, and I don't think the textures are set to load. So if I hit 6 now, there we go, we can see that texture. Right, so you get actually really good kind of silhouette still, right? Display, show, heads up display, sorry. Oops, heads up display, poly count. So yeah, I mean, it's 5,000 polys, but it's not terrible, and we're still getting, the good kind of UVs that we had. So if we check them out, they're still there. They're still in the basic arrangement. The texture map that I made. So it's a little extra step. I basically, whatever I had as a Dynamesh, or if I had to mesh with divisions, I had to get it to a clean low-res mesh to unwrap it. So that's the key point. Get it to a state where you can unwrap a version of it or unwrap it. Then you decimate it, but keep the UV borders, so you can get this kind of mesh that's way better than. Let's go back in history if we can. So I'll try to, yeah, let's get back to this, right? So let me just see if I can clone this thing, because I think if I go Z it back in, it's going to just replace it. Yeah. So what is this doing? Let's set that back to raw. I guess I lost my texture, but there. So you can see the difference, right? You know, when it comes to silhouette and things like that, it's, you know, one is vastly superior than the other. So especially if I, let's say, apply my Lambert here, and I'm just gonna, right, make them totally dark. You know, it's those little kind of micro details that kind of still maintain that, you know, sort of silhouette integrity, which you don't get from a super simple low-res mesh. And I've heard some students say, oh, like, I'll just, yeah, I mean, if you want to block organic stuff, you can. But yeah, you don't need to get into too much detail, you know? You don't need to go crazy. And I haven't really done any, I don't do a ton of foliage work, but you can to some degree through, I just recommend being very careful because it adds a lot of poly. So let's say I take a ground plane, make polymesh, divide it a few times, and then if you mask certain areas, okay, like this, let's say, you can do something that's called fiber mesh. Now again, I'm showing you but warning you. Fiber mesh, you can preview it and it just has, you know, some basic black fibers. If you go to Lightbox actually has a bunch of presets, so there is kind of like foliage. Sorry, let me just double click that. Yeah. If we go to modifiers, you can increase the number of fibers, you know, to get a different look. But this is, again, it's heavy. It's just more mesh. Technically right now it's only in preview mode. So what does that mean? Well, if you clear your mask, they go away. If you paint over here and then preview again, it'll kind of grow out there. And if you hit accept, if you like the settings, there's basically definitions of how many polys you get. So if you hit Shift F, we don't see it yet, but once you hit accept, it'll warn you, you know, this is going to be kind of a fixed tool. And that's 200,000 polys. So there's a bunch of tiny, skinny little polys there. So just be very careful with it. You know, I think it's a fine tool. It's not a terrible tool. There are some ZBrush tutorials on actually making lots of really cool, you know, organic type of objects. And we can also do it in Maya if you just basically do an array. You know, you can build a flower petal. It's the same thing I would do in ZBrush. You build one petal, you clone it and rotate it around a bunch of times. So anyways, yeah, let me just go back to fiber mesh just to show you guys a couple more presets. They're just fun to kind of look at, but again, I think, yeah, these are kind of hanging down in a weird direction. I don't know if that's maybe to do with the gravity. Yeah, so you can play with gravity profile. There's brushes associated with this. If you have B for brush, G for groom. There's basically grooming brushes. So if you hit, this is like a, I guess I can't, I have to accept this first. Yeah. Yeah, these will kind of like swirl stuff together. B for brush, G for groom. So there's different types of grooms. Grooming into spikes. But again, I don't have a ton of experience with the grooming and all that in here. I believe Shift will smooth these out. So if you wanted to, you could, you know, I guess you can play around with it, but like I said, it's just, it can add a lot of weight to the scene. So if you don't have a particularly good machine at home or even in the labs, just be very careful about how you're going to go about, you know, integrating any fiber mesh. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, blocking. So yeah, I was sort of showing it earlier. Let's say we take our simple plane here. You want to build some stairs, so it's really great. We can just, again, I always sort of plan out by having roughly the right amount of divisions that I think I'm going to want. So you may want, yeah, maybe even more than that. 12 by 12 is probably a good starting point. And then if I go to ZModeler, right, we got to make sure this is also a polymesh. So I'm going to say make polymesh. Hold Alt. Oops. Let me go back to there. So I'm going 3 back, 2 high. There we go. Yeah, I think that's good. I'll just say polygroup. Oh, what do I want to grab? Okay, so now I can delete this polygroup. So I'm going to hide it by Control-Shift clicking on it. Go to Delete Hidden. And then if I do Q Mesh, I'll do all polys in this case. There's my stairs. And I want to put edge loops in. So if you go in while you're hovering over an edge, spacebar, insert, go to multiple loops, and if you, I think these are the defaults except for this alternating, so you can keep the same group or same polygroup. Then you can kind of add in as many divisions as you feel like you might need, which is really cool. Like I said, if you just divide right away, it's going to smooth out weirdly. So what you can do is just go in, if you're using divisions, you can just turn off this little SMT or smooth button. I don't know why they didn't spell out smooth, since it'll fit inside the button, but you can divide it like 2, 3, 4 times, then turn on smoothing, and it'll give it a little bit of softening, you know. I also noticed too, I was getting this creasing at the bottom, so maybe before all that division work, I'm going to just go to crease and say uncrease all. And then, yeah, turn off smooth, divide a few times, and then smooth on, divide. Yeah, and then I would basically just use the trim brush. So I'll go to trim dynamic right here. So that's what I usually use to kind of like damage up the edges of things. Right. Pretty good brush. If you're getting the brush stroke is kind of breaking up a bit, you know, you might like that as a certain texture, which can be interesting, so it looks almost kind of chewed away. But if you want a smoother, more solid stroke, what I usually do is go to stroke, lazy mouse, turn on lazy mouse. There's basically 4 key settings here. The first one is the lazy step, so this one I usually leave at 0.025. So what that does is give you a buttery smooth brush stroke, right? Like it's just a solid line. So same thing happens with the, let's say we just use a freehand brush with no alpha, the standard brush. If you drag it across fast enough, it'll kind of leave little ghosting trails of the alpha that's active. Same thing if I go to clay, right? It'll break up the stroke, whereas if you move slower, it sort of keeps it more solid. So the key to that is to turn on lazy mouse, and I usually turn down lazy smooth and lazy radius to basically their lowest amount, and lazy snap to 0. And the step I usually set to 0.025. That's kind of my preferred number. Then you get a nice solid stroke. So you'd have to do that per brush, right? So in the smooth brush, I'd have to do the same thing, 0.025. So a nice solid line. If you actually lower that number, that might even be a little bit too high, or a little bit too low. If you lower it too much, let's say 0.01, it'll really exaggerate the strength of the brush, so just keep that in mind as well. Anyway, so let's get back to that. So yeah, I kind of actually in some ways like the chaoticness of the broken stroke, so I'll just leave that off. So yeah, I'd go through and kind of chip away at things like this. You know, if you want any patterning, stonework and stuff like that, you know, I would kind of place these things in. So yeah, let's just kind of really chip away. It's funny, I noticed this on the Metro actually too. You'll see, especially because of salt and things like that, it just kind of like some of the edges remain and then others are kind of there, but not really that well. Yeah. So, and you can vary, you know, brush stroke size and strength and intensity. Those are things I'm constantly doing. Right now, I have no pressure sensitivity, so because I'm working with a mouse, I should have really got my tablet out, but that's okay. All right, so we can Go down here, a bit lower, get some finer texture in there. So that's just all trim dynamic. That's really it. You know, in terms of a building or a wall, a brick wall, you know, I usually like to start with the individual bricks. You know, there are times when I've just taken a whole wall texture and just kind of put it on and pulled it out via masking, which you can do if you have a big enough, high enough resolution image, which you can use as an alpha and a full enough wall, or you can use things like the alpha brush. So if, for example, let's build a cube. And yeah, this is going to be okay. By the way, if you go into the, for some people who don't know this, if you go into, I think it's the Polymesh 3D, which is basically the sort of star icon, and then you go down to initialize before you actually start sculpting, you can actually make a Q cube, which is literally just a nice evenly divided cube. So if you know, you want a longer kind of house, it's maybe twice the length as the width. Then you hit Q cube. Yeah, it's not really the right res that I'm going for, but yeah, let's try that. Right, so it's kind of a nice, simple, proportionate, evenly divided object. Okay, so I'm going to say make polymesh to start editing. So this is just a basic template. So let's say I'll go back to my Z modeler brush, hold Alt, Q mesh, oops. I want to Q mesh not all polys, but this poly group. Oh, it's going way far back. Yeah, let's just move this. I'll slide. Yeah, maybe just the edge. I'll slide it forward if I can. It's a bit odd. Alright, let me just grab this polygroup then. Oops. You can also try this. If you get a weird result, you can also align your tool to your polygroup by alt-clicking on it, hold Alt and reset the pivot, and then scale it nice and flat. So we can kind of try to correct for some of these errors that way. And if you control-click on the group, again, alt-click to reset the arrow, you can adjust things like the depth if we, yeah, I may have to actually just isolate it. Yeah. Okay. So you can do roughly the same. So let's say you polygroup for some windows and then you just pull them in. And then I believe this is a, oh, that's not a, yeah, when you do a Q mesh, by the way, the top and bottom polys, like the left and right side, this is one kind of group. Right, so these two sides are a group, the top and bottom are a group, the front and back are a group. So if I isolate this, and let's go to double-sided there so we can see that. Usually I will hide one, hit Control W to make a new group. So then I can freely fix that. And I'm gonna just, I think, collapse this edge. Well, let's see. Let's see, I may actually just delete these. Delete, edge loop complete. Man, this software sometimes. Okay, let's go, I'll stitch instead. There. So I just want to kind of create a bit of a sloped roof here. Should just be doing this in symmetry. That would be the smart thing to do. Yeah, I think because of those windows, it's not liking it. Okay. Yeah, you have to be very careful about your selections too. I'll switch my material. I usually like to go to the skin shade 4, which for some reason isn't in my default right now. Restore custom. There, skin shade 4. Find it easier to look at the interface there. Oops. Okay. This is a little boring, but this is when good music is important. That was a bit of a mess. Alright, there we go. Why won't you? There we go. Let's see. Well, I'm going to leave that for now. Okay, so you can create your own brick brush. In this case, I'm going to just use one of the ones that's already in there. Under tool, under brush, be under insert IMM. There's a brick brush. And I'm just gonna make sure this is a poly mesh. It's poly mesh. There we go. Okay, so there's a couple ways we can go about this, right? First way is to kind of just make a sheet of bricks. So if we go back to our trusty plane, I'm going to make this thing actually a little wider. So instead of actually going right away to Dynamesh, I'm going to scale this thing wider and then up the horizontal divides and then scale it. Sorry, I should actually be doing that through here, just making it shorter and then adjusting the divides here. Okay, so if we make that a poly mesh, so it's actually editable. And if we go to, so this is a IMM brush, an insert multi-mesh brush, which if we, it has multiple bricks. So if you drag one out, there's different types of bricks, right? You can convert this or say create a nanomesh brush. So now we insert a nanomesh, right? And just make sure it's on all polys, all polygons. Right, so this is one really interesting way you can kind of get a repeating pattern. So let me just pick a simpler kind of brick that's maybe less erratic, so the patterning won't be as detectable. So we can play with rotation. We can adjust the size. Right, and then you can vary them if you want. So in this case, I think the rotations aren't really all that helpful, but sorry, that's the tile variation. But we can definitely vary. Let's take a look at from the side. The the horizontal positioning we can adjust. Vertical. So we can have more random offsets there. So that's one way to go about creating a brick pattern. And again, once you're ready to actually sort of edit that or put that into your scene, you can say convert BPR to Geo, and it's going to basically turn that into real editable sculptable mesh. And then I would usually just hide off the back plane and delete it. Let's switch to a standard brush there. There. Now, another way to go about this, and you can see this is actually quite heavy. This is because these insert brushes are quite dense, each individual one, so that's a bit of a problem. The way I like to do it, I'm going to show you guys from scratch, is to use something like nano mesh, but it's a little different. It's called array mesh. So I'll go back to this sort of cube thing here. So yeah, cube, well, a standard like red brick I think is, if I'm not mistaken, what is it? I think it's 2 by 4 or 3 by 6, something like that. So make polymesh, and I would just dynamesh it down really, really low. So I'm going to go dynamesh. Very low res. Let's see how low I can go. This is not bad. It's 2000 polys for just this. Maybe even go lower if I can. Yeah, I guess that's about as low as it'll go. And if we go under geometry, the first panel below it is array mesh. And again, there's presets in here which are fantastic. So you can click on the preset, and there's already a brick preset. So if you check that out, it's actually making a wall. And essentially there's a bunch of stages. So there's stage 1, which is the initial line. Then there's the second row that is offset, and then a copy of those 3. So let me just show you that. Let me adjust. So each one is offset by a certain amount. So I'm going to have to offset the first stage. This is transform stage 1. Go to stage 2, and I need to increase the offset on this on the y-axis by roughly that amount. And whenever you want to add a stage, you just simply hit append new. It'll add a new stage that you can basically edit and tweak like this. And then you can also randomize, which is really great. So if you want, it's a little bit high on that offset there. Yeah, let's see what we got. Just turn off perspective so I can see the gaps a little better too. Yeah, it's a little off there, but yeah, maybe just -9 there. It's not bad. Okay. And again, you can increase the repetition, how many copies, but then you have to adjust your offsets. So I might actually go back down to stage 1, increase the repeat a bunch on that, because I do need a longer wall, and then adjust the offset amount there. And you see it just carries that all the way through, right? So what happens is from stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, you actually have to collapse this down by saying make mesh, make mesh, make mesh. And now each of these stages is alive. Oops, let's do this one more time. Maybe I'll try that BPR to Geo, see what happens there. There we go. BPR to Geo will turn this into a full-fledged array. Now this is still dense, right? It's 1.5 million polys. So what you can do, if you want to, again, start editing it, you can sculpt in a texture if you want. You can use alphas as a texture. I often like to use the surface noise because it basically is generated mathematically. And maybe let me just cancel this for a sec and switch to, the reason I like dynameshing, even at a low res like that, with 2000 polys, if you go into noise, I usually like to start with the large scale noise first. So I'm going to probably max this out and then make it positive. Now I don't want it to blow out in the preview, so I want it to just kind of feel like it adds something to the surface. If I say apply to mesh, does that work? It's not terrible. Now, if you're not sure about that, let's turn off noise. What you can also do is go to morph target. Morph target will look at the mesh in its current state. You can store the morph target. And then if you go back to surface and turn that on and say apply to mesh, right? So I'm maxing out that that noise, but if I go back to the morph target, I can actually say, let's dial it back a bit. Let's actually go back in between the two. We want something that's kind of like just a little, right? A little lighter. And then you can just say delete morph target, and that information is now gone. Right, so this is one way you can kind of like store a snapshot of the model and then sort of dial things back. So this is just a good starting point. Let's go back to our base house. Where do we have it here? Okay, so if we're going to add this brick, let's go in. I'm going to say into subtool, go to append. I'll grab my new brick wall, which, oops, not that one. Delete that one. I think it's this one. Yeah. So let's append the correct wall, which will be this one. And the scale is a little bit off here between the two. Where is my house? Let's scale this down and see. There's my house. So this brick wall is massive compared to the house. So let's just scale this down. So if you're trying to get around like door trim and stuff like that, what you can do is exaggerate. Let's just center the pivot. Oops, center it to the unmasked points there. Rotate. So let's overlap that. So I usually exaggerate the depth a bit, because then I can do something kind of special. Let's pull that brick just back. And if we go to live boolean, so my live boolean button is down here. In the default, I think it's somewhere in the top bar. So if I go live boolean and I want to do the intersection, which should give me something like that. Now I think it's kind of clipping out in a bit of a weird way, so I want to make sure. Let's go back to the house for a second, and I'm going to solo that. Yeah, I'm going to control shift. Oops. Control shift click on that, and then just, yeah, let me try to auto group this stuff. I'm going to go, I think auto groups in here. No. Polygroups, auto groups, and then I can also go to group by normals. There. So what I want to do is just actually push this stuff back in space. Okay. This can be a real pain in the ass, by the way, sometimes. Okay. Control W. So I'm just going to pull it back. So what I'm doing with that, I don't know if you guys can see that, but this is the intersection between the two. So right now this would be a merge. This would be an intersection. Where there's overlap is what will be merged together, and this is this section left behind if we take the sort of space between the two. Now let me just solo this thing. What did I do here? Oh my goodness. Let me just turn off live boolean for a second. Okay. Oh, all right. For some reason I lost my polygroups. Okay. I really don't know what's going on. That's being super weird. Alright. Maybe I'll just extrude it back in one more time. Okay. Let's get it a solo. There we go. Now you can also go into transparency mode too. So we want to kind of see where we're sitting in terms of the depth here. So you can sort of use this as a cutter, and I want that overlap. So live boolean. That's roughly the result, and then you can say geometry, geometry. Sorry, it would be under subtool. Boolean, make boolean mesh. So it's going to actually make another mesh here. So I'll turn off live boolean. So usually it's called a union mesh. So it'll be a U mesh like that. Go to append, U mesh. I can hide my sort of template wall. And now I should be able to pull out this. So it'll sort of sit just in front of the surface. Now if you have cleanup to do, that's not a big deal to do. You know, there might be some little shards left of some mesh here. You can sort of see those little thin pieces. Sometimes I just trim them off, so go to trim curve. And if trim doesn't work, you can try slice. So yeah, I'll go back to trim. There. Trim doesn't work on the interior shapes, unfortunately, so you may have to go in and perform a little surgery. So sometimes what I do is I'll go into auto groups, which will automatically give each brick its own little color coding. So if you click on, so I shouldn't be in the move tool, let me clear that mask. Ugh. Get out of here. There we go. Now you can also do this sort of stuff more by hand and isolate bricks, so because sometimes bricks will overlap more. So you can use a slice or trim tool to get rid of mesh this way. This guy doesn't want to go away. There. Okay. So yeah, just some of those sloppy bits I'm going to take care of, delete out. So you can go back to geometry and you can dynamesh again. And what's great about this is you can, you know, sort of play with your resolution. Be very careful, because you can see this is a lot smaller scale compared to the other objects. So I'm going to just go to dynamesh, and yeah, I'm going to have to crank my resolution here. This brings up a good point. How big is this whole scene? Not that big. Yeah, I think there's something wrong with the scale of this thing. So I'll try to match that. Okay, so that's pretty close. So I just basically set the scale to two units, basically ZBrush units. So you can go around and do wall by wall this way. For me though, honestly I like to kind of cut through certain, so I would hide off every other row and get them to interlock at the corners if that's what you need to see. If it's more like a cabin or something, you can cheat by putting kind of like basic log objects there, or corner trim if you want. But the scaling I showed earlier, you can do shingles that way as well, roof shingles, siding as well. Can be done that way. So if you had siding instead, so let's say we put siding on the front, again I would just start with a simple cube. Before I do that, I'm going to just reset to clean up my tool palette because I've kind of got everything I need here now. I'll go back in, start with a basic, I'll probably start with the Q cube. So for that I'll have to go to the poly mesh, I guess. I really want a simple mesh, so I'm going to actually just go back into the initialize panel and set it to 1 by 1 by 1 and hit Q cube. Okay, let's just check there's my kind of front view. Let's go to symmetry. Okay. So scale this thing nice and wide. Let me just make poly mesh. Scale it thinner and wider. There. It's very, very basic, right? And then, yeah, I'll make it a little thinner than that, actually. Okay, so then I'm going to rotate it. I guess it doesn't have to be precise. I'm going to maybe rotate about 10 degrees. And remember what I said. This is just simple mesh. So right now it's pivoted. It's on an angle. So if you hit W, you can then hold Alt and reset to align to the world. And I can just simply array this thing. So I'm going to kind of get out of the way, array mesh, and I'm going to basically move it up on X. So move it up and then give it a ton of copies. So on repeat. Right, there you go. You get some decent looking shingles. If you want them to be in a bit more contact, that's fine. If you want to dynamesh though, it could make an unholy blobby mess. So for this stuff, I might try to just work more with divisions than dynamesh because you get so many little pieces. I'll show you what I mean. Let's just go to make mesh. And now it's a live sculptable mesh. Now, technically there's no polys in here. It's just like super simple. So if I just basically sculpt with a standard brush, it's going to kind of pull out in this kind of funny way. But if I divide, it's going to divide and smooth in a weird way too. So, but what I mean is that, yeah, if you want to divide this, then you'd probably want to slice through, which would just give these different poly groups. And you could just go in and now I would have worked on the first one, but in this case I would turn off smooth, divide a bunch, turn on smoothing maybe later on, and then divide a bunch more, and then you can sculpt these a little more directly. But in this case I'm going to keep them ultra simple, ultra low poly. Just reset the pivot, turn off symmetry, and reset it to the center of the object there. Okay. So I'll delete any high-res stuff. So let's go back to the house. Right here. Let's go to bricks on one side. So with bricks in a wall, I usually like to embed the bricks in the wall a bit. Right, because there's that kind of plaster that's connected to it. So I would actually, before doing anything else, I may merge these together. I usually like to keep my base template as a template I can continue to use, so I would duplicate it. You can always export it or save it off somewhere else. But with this and this wall, I'm going to move this up. I'll take this version of the house and I'm going to go to merge down. So when I've got bricks and grout in between, what's going on here? Delete hidden. Sure. Okay. So I'm going to merge down. Okay. So you see it's in one mesh, but they're not really connected yet. So what you can do is go into dynamesh this together. So go geometry, Dynamesh, hit Dynamesh. Now, of course, you want to test out and see what that's going to look like. So let's just increase the resolution. I'm at about 1 million polys now, so I probably want to stick to that or even go a bit higher. So this will take a little moment to calculate. Okay, so now it's one sort of solid surface. Okay. So what's great about that is, like, you know, before you merge the house in, you could also Dynamesh it separately and put a different texture on that if you want. Technically, this should have polygroups, and if we hit Shift F and I'll turn off the line option, you can see I can also now isolate the grout in between. And let me just hide off. Oops. Don't want to slice that. I want to hide it. So yeah, I'm just going to hide that. Make it a new group, and then yeah, on this part I can just do a unique noise to that. So you can mask off areas or you can hide areas and then apply a unique noise. So maybe I'll give it a little bit more of a, it's kind of hard to see there. Okay. More of a fine grit, which is something you might see more out of, you know, the mortar in between bricks, and then apply to mesh. And then we'll unhide all. Oops, unhide all. There we go. So now you've got kind of these two textures, right? Okay, so for siding, so remember, I'm going to go back to, you know, let's say for the front part of the house, I'll take that simple low poly mesh that I made, the shingles or the siding, and let's get that to scale. Saving a project, okay. All right, we're coming up on the end here, so if anybody has any questions, specific ones, please get them in now. Okay, so again, I just want, you know, enough overlap. I'm going to do what I did basically the last time. If you wanted, you know, the shingles to extend over, then you could, you know, this is, I should probably rename this too. This is going to be my template, so I'm going to rename this template house. So some stuff, you know, I'll decide I want to keep as one piece. Usually when it comes to brick and mortar, and if it's on a bunch of sides of an object, I usually like to kind of make a core for that. Or if you have big old ancient stone slabs and they're part of a wall system and an archway, build that shape underneath first, and then you can kind of work on the bricks separately, use noise, use sculpting, use damage, right? And then you want to Dynamesh them together. The reason is when you have multiple stones, they need to be at such a high resolution, and you're basically rendering, remember, a cube or a stone, which is essentially a distorted or disproportionate cube, will have 6 sides. Technically, you're only really interested on the one side that you're going to see, and maybe a little bit of the edging that might stick out. So think about that. Your poly count would need to be 6 times higher if you had all of those bricks separate and floating inside of a mortar, and you're not seeing those sides. So you're losing probably about 60-70% in a brick wall. If it's like huge stacks stone slabs, then you're missing more. You're only going to see, you know, one side, maybe 3 sides if it's a cornerstone of some kind. So that's when I would Dynamesh things together, usually when it's stonework or something. If it's something like siding, I may not. And, you know, I can keep them separate. I can tear one off. You can also remove individual bricks too before you Dynamesh in. So if you want to see an area that has bricks missing and there's a hole in the wall, then you have to be a little bit strategic and say, okay, I can keep them separate for a certain amount of time and I'll have some left in the wall. It just takes a little bit of planning. So I'm going to go back into Boolean, live Boolean, and do the same thing. I want not the addition or the subtraction, but the overlap. And you see I get this nice clean cutout of that, and I'll say Boolean, make Boolean mesh. It's going to make that U mesh, which I then, of course, so let me turn off the Boolean, turn off the start. So the start indicates a new start for Boolean, and so I moved it down towards the bottom, and below that was my simple siding that I built. So I'm going to hide that visibility, append, bring in the wall. Oops, make sure I'm selecting the wall. Always a problem I find with this. Pull it out front. Oops, again, wrong addition. Turn off that. Yeah, we've got too many subtools now. There, okay. So I'll pull that one out just so it's sitting in front. So again, I want to make sure I turn off my template house. Let's turn on the base that I have here. Okay, so you can see this thing is, you know, starting to come together. Now let's just solo this for a second. So if you guys notice too, there's polygroups here, right? So if I isolate the sides, let me just turn on wireframe as well. I want to double check to see. Yeah, I've got a line down the middle, which is good. So I'm going to try to isolate just those red polygroups, as you can see here, right? Make sure they're double-sided so I can see them all. So if you ever want to extend that siding just beyond, I would probably split this into two groups, and I don't want to affect the middle or the, yeah, maybe not the bottom either. I'm just going to hide this off here. I'm going to try to be very careful just to get the sides. For some reason, these guys want to pop back into existence. So maybe I'll start that way. I'm just going to hide 1/2. Or give it a new polygroup. Yeah, it's being a little touchy. Sometimes this stuff gets so weird in ZBrush, but yeah. Tell you what, I'll try this. So go into a bit of a side view, hold Control, drag it over 1/2, Control W. May not look like a different group, but it basically should be. Yeah, if you can't get it to work one way, sometimes you have to just force it to work a different way. There we go. So I just want these two different groups. I'm going to also maybe mask this out and just give it one group, because I really don't want to affect the bottom polys at all. I'll explain why in a second. I just don't want to alter the door frame. That's kind of the key to this, is that you don't want to, because the door opening isn't changing, but I may want to just extend the width. So I'm going to try. There we go. Okay, so I think that should be enough. As long as I think I can protect those interior edges, I think I should be good. So the idea behind this is if you hit Control, click on that one group, just make sure we're oriented to space, you can pull this thing a little wider, okay? So that's kind of the idea, is that we can kind of pull this a little wider, get it a solo, and then you can get a bit of coverage. Now, one thing you could do is always alter your template as well. So before, you know, doing the boolean, you can just fix that up. Okay, let's push this a bit further back there. So that's, I guess, a bit of a breakdown on how you'd approach, you know, doing that sort of basic layout, getting things together. The damage is really just as simple as, you know, loading in a brush if you've got any, or alphas, and we talked a bit about that, how to make alphas. So I've got XMD kit, which has a ton of really good, cool damage brushes, so I'm going to just bring one in. Right. So you can try to splotch in some damage, and if you want, this right now is just an alpha on drag. If you hold Control, you can switch this to a drag brush and then load that same alpha, so you can mask it out like so. And then in that area, what you can try to do is smooth it out, so we get rid of the brick. So if we want to damage into the kind of, let's say, concrete underneath, if there is any, I might try to smooth this out. Now I'm dealing with high poly counts at 4.8 million. So if you go into a light box, which is the comma key, right? Comma key, and then click on brush. And we want to go to smooth. There's extended smooth brushes, and I'm going to use smooth stronger. So hold shift, and that'll be the new smoothing brush. So you really want to kind of work out those areas, or even just maybe go to trim dynamic just to kind of flatten those regions a bit. Smooth, trim if you need to, and then you can try to do an inflate. So the selection should still basically work. Again, this might be a situation where if you know you're going to punch a hole through something, you may need to make this thing have a cavity, so it's got an interior space. The bricks might be separate so that you can delete some of the bricks when there's a hole through the wall. But in this case, I just want to kind of put some superficial damage. So deformation, and then I'll do a negative inflate on that. So the negative inflate should still kind of pull that in to give me some of that damage. Then we can clear the mask. Now the great thing is you can reapply damage. A lot of times too, I like to I don't want to overuse the same brush, but I will use, sorry, let me just go to load brush here. I'll load another damage brush. Right, so you can kind of drop it in a couple times to the point at which even, any underlying structure isn't entirely, recognizable. And if you drag it in on different scales at different intensities, it's, not always easy to see that it was just brushed in, right? So you can get a fairly organic look that way. So again, I like to mix up brushes if I can. The other thing to watch out for is you can see this damage is incredibly deep. So at that point, you should be seeing wood, or the wall would have broken away, or the exterior wall would have broken away. So you want to watch out for the scale of texture, the scale of damage that you're applying to, that it makes sort of sense for the scene. I often find, it's, such a cheesy old saying, but it's true, less is more. So if you go sometimes with a little bit of a lower intensity, that can help. And remember, you can always, let me just switch back to a regular masking brush. Right, if you want to add some additional texture and noise, we can just mask an area, flip it around, and then you can go into surface noise, and we can add some other layers of texture. And again, we want to adjust our strength maybe. Yeah, let me just edit this. Yeah, let's make it a little kind of rougher and just a little more subtle there. And also, if you're dragging in damage, sometimes you can reverse the direction to maybe fix some depth issues. Okay, I'll see if there's any more questions. Any more requests? All right, well, I think that might be it then for tonight. Let me just see. We still have some viewers. Okay. I think that'll be it for tonight. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.